Last week, I was with a family in the hospital, and their loved one was very sick. Very sick. And I spent some time with them just listening, being present. And then I offered to pray with them. And they said, "Chaplain, we've been crying out to God. And crying out to God. And crying out to God. And we're still waiting." And so I joined them and continued to cry out to God. We cry out. We cry out for healing. We cry out for God's love. We cry out for mercy. We cry out for forgiveness. We cry out for presence. And we cry out for justice. We cry out. The Israelites cried out, did they not? I love this story. It's one of my favorites. In this story we have the worst of humanity and some of the best. A new king arose over Egypt, and he did not know Joseph, meaning he did not know Israel, and he did not know God. He was paranoid, deeply insecure, and incited violence. Sound familiar? This new king was afraid of the Israelites, and he imposed oppressive work on them, slave masters. And the more he tried, the more the Israelites flourished because they were the children of God. And he continued to oppress them. And then he brought the midwives into it. He got this idea, well, if I have the midwives murder all the young boy children, the infants, then maybe that will stop them. But see, what he didn't know was, even though he didn't know God, the midwives knew God. And now we see some of the best of humanity. And they took a risk, they took courage, and they defied his orders. And the Israelites continued to flourish. But they got tired. They were sick and tired of being treated like they were not citizens. They were sick and tired of being oppressed. And so they cried out. They cried out. And I love this metaphorical image of God, that God took notice, God heard, God responded. It is important to know what all of this means. God heard them, God remembered, God saw them, God took notice. What we hear in this is that in the essence of this is that God was so intimately involved in the suffering of the Israelites that he experienced their suffering with them. In essence, when they cried out to God, it was really God crying out through them. God knew their pain so intimately that even God cries out, church. That even God cries out. We cry out. We cry out for presence. We cry out for healing. We cry out for forgiveness. We cry out for justice. Sometimes it seems like we're just waiting on God to respond. But I believe in that waiting, God is loving us in ways that we cannot even comprehend. God is loving us through it. We cry out. And those are the times when we need to remember the blessing. The blessing that once we accept the blessing, we allow it to transform our lives. And the blessing is that we are God's beloved. That God is so intimately close to us in this life, that God experiences all of life with us. The joys, the pain, the celebration, and the suffering. And through it all, we are loved unconditionally. I love to tell the story of Heinz Kohut, a famous psychoanalyst and sort of the pioneer of self-psychology. He was standing before a group of social workers and therapists, and mental health workers and school teachers. And he said, you have the mother and her 6-month-old daughter. And the daughter begins to crawl on the floor. And the daughter crawls away from the mother. And then the daughter turns around. What is she looking for as she looks back at her mother? Hands go up. Well, she's looking to make sure that mom is still there. Kohut said, it's good, but that's not the answer I'm looking for. Someone else raises their hand. I know. She's looking back to see the smile of approval on her mother's face, to make sure it's safe. Kohut said, it's a good answer. It's not what I'm looking for. And finally, Kohut said, this is what the child is looking for. When she looks back at her mother, she's looking for the gleam in her mother's eye. The sparkle in her mother's eye. She's looking back to know that she's still her mother's beloved. What a beautiful image for God. Church, you are the gleam in God's eye. You are the sparkle in God's eyes. You are God's beloved. When we cry out, we may have to wait. We may have to wait. But in the waiting, please know that you are loved unconditionally. That God is experiencing it through you. And that you will always be the gleam in God's eyes.